So this is an unofficial in-house use only recording of how to do some short arm splinting. We're going to do first an ulnar gutter for metacarpal fractures, and then also we'll do a short arm sugar tongue type on the other side, which would be for like a distal radius. So starting with the ulnar gutter, it's usually done for fractures of the metacarpals, usually the boxer's fracture, but also the metacarpal base fracture. There's two things you should know about boxer's fracture versus metacarpal base fracture. With the boxer's fracture, you'll often be more comfortable with the hand kicked back just a little bit. With the metacarpal base fracture, that often causes some pain, so you'll want to just put the wrist in a more neutral position. Okay, so I'll show you the boxer's fracture because it's the more common one you're going to see. But if your splint is causing pain, always adjust it. Don't go based on what the textbook says in terms of how to position. Base it for, especially for temporary use, patient comfort. So we start off, at least the way I do it, I use plaster, not orthoglass, because I just find that it's more comfortable for most people. So I'm going to grab a scissor, sorry. Put a little hole for the thumb. Right about there. It doesn't have to be that big because it will stretch. And I like to use a stockinette underneath because it's more comfortable, and also you can use it to hold your plaster later. So it's always nice to have an assistant to hold things to keep them from falling too. Good there. And then I also like to put a stockinette on the fingers as well. And you'll include these two fingers for a fifth or even a fourth. If it's in the middle, then you'll probably include all four fingers and just leave the thumb free. So we'll just do two for now. And then there are two ways to pad. Some people pad the plaster, which is an option. I usually like to wrap the hand or wrist first, just so I know the padding's there, and then I can work with the plaster independently. But if you want to just put padding on the plaster like you would with orthoglass, that's okay too. So I usually wrap the fingers first, just because they're right there. Why not? And then have the patient do that. You can hold their hand. Almost everybody tries to help you when you're splinting them, and none of them should, but you'll have to coach them through it. Thumb out, there we go. And we'll just kind of show you the side view later too. You don't have to be incredibly fussy with how your padding is placed, other than you don't want it to wrinkle up too much to cause a pressure area, and you just want to make sure there's enough of it to keep the plaster from irritating the skin or pushing on a bony prominence. So the ulnar styloid is particularly important. Through the forearm, it's less so important because you don't have bony prominences there. And then I'll usually lay some along the ulnar styloid itself. Alrighty, and then once you have what you need, I get my 10 layers, or whoever's helping me will get 10 layers of, I'm using 4-inch in this case. You can kind of tailor it based on size. If it's too big in any direction, you can always rip it. So you can see this one, I want it about that long, so I'm just going to rip it. If you want to do fewer layers at a time, you can. If you want to practice, phone books aren't really used anymore, so you can do that. Alright, and I like this, so I'm not going to narrow it at all. Then all you have to do is make sure your patient's protected from splatter and get it wet. And when you're wetting plaster like this, you always want to massage it a little bit to get the layers to stick together. That'll give you a better bond and a stronger chunk of plaster when you're done. That also keeps some of the drippage from getting all over, which usually makes you more popular with your clinical assistants. Nothing? No? then for this one, you want to just make sure you get enough of the finger, wrap it around, and right there, you just kind of bring it along the forearm there. Make sure that you've got padding on the end of it. And then this is why I leave the tubing grip a little long. If you pull it up over the edge, now you've got the edge covered and it helps secure your plaster. Same thing on the fingers here. Just bring those down. And now it basically stays on its own, so you don't have to worry about your plaster falling. And I always take my gloves off once I get to this point, because otherwise you get plaster all over your Coban. I use Coban because I just find it's easier to secure stuff with it. Ace wrap is acceptable too, but the thing about Coban is you don't want to stretch too much. So what you do is you bring it out and then you let it come back a bit, so there's just a little bit of squeeze on there. You never want to stretch it as you wrap it because you'll get it too tight. That's a very common reason for people to come back, is a splint that was a little too tight. And then around the thumb, you have to get a little bit creative to make sure they're secured without being too restrictive. So I usually will run it up through here and then turn it as I go through. Just a half turn. You can always do another one if you're feeling like you need to cover more of it. Otherwise you can just bring it up across here. Then getting through the fingers can be a little tricky if somebody's in a lot of pain, but usually they do pretty well with this. You can also, at this point, abandon the larger roll and switch to like a 1-inch roll. I'll do that sometimes with people with smaller hands. And in your case, I could have done that, but it'll be okay. Make sure the Coban's back a little bit from the padding so you can see the edge of it pretty well. Coban, you can rip it or cut it. It's a little cleaner if you cut it. And then you just have to hold them until the plaster hardens. So I'm putting it with just a little bit of extension of the wrist and a little bit of flexion of the fingers, and that'll help keep them in a more neutral position. If it was a metacarpal base fracture, that might actually cause them pain, so then I would just give them a little bit of flexion of the wrist to offload some pressure. And there's that. Just set them on a pillow and then allow them to dry before you let them leave. It can take a crease from being rested on a hard surface for up to a half hour after being put in. So you just have to tell the patient, don't rest it on any hard surfaces, keep it on soft stuff. Slings are optional for this type of thing. Sometimes I like to give them a sling just so they remember to be careful with it or to prevent jostling too much. But the main thing is to get them well immobilized and tell them to elevate to prevent swelling. The other thing I didn't mention is that if they have any rings on, you've got to get them off because their fingers will swell and it can cause some pretty serious issues. So take any and all rings off anytime they put a splint on a wrist or a hand. And that's pretty much it for that one.